Welcome to the EPG Pathshala Linguistics course. I'm Prabal Dasgupta from the Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. I'm responsible for the morphology and syntax paper in this course. This particular session will deal with module number 28, which looks at clefting, scrambling, and zones. Zones are a new technical term. Clefting is a phenomenon which in English covers two constructions, one of which you've seen quite often in the glosses that we were giving for the focus examples in Hindi, Urdu, and in Bangla. We'll now look at English itself and also look at pseudo-clefts which have not played a role in these glosses. 1a is the cleft sentence. It is the problem of diagnosis that you must tackle first, which corresponds to 2a, the pseudo-cleft counterpart. What you must tackle first is the problem of diagnosis. If you look at the geometry of the cleft construction, it is the problem of diagnosis that you must tackle first, and that of the pseudo-cleft construction. What you must tackle first is the problem of diagnosis. You notice that they share focal stress on the element, the problem of diagnosis, which is the focus. The cleft construction starts with it and then has a form of the copula, the verb to be. It is, in this case. After that piece of the architecture of a cleft, you get the focus. So you get it is focus, that clause. It is the problem of diagnosis that you must tackle first. In the pseudo-cleft, the focus is on the extreme right. What you must tackle first is the problem of diagnosis. There is a really striking difference between the cleft construction and the pseudo-cleft construction. If you look at the pseudo-cleft, you find examples like 2b, c, d, e. 2b. Where we shall meet your father is in the big hall. What I do expect is to continue to work here. What Sally always does is spoil the fun. What Ramesh is taller than the other boys. What are the foci in these sentences? 2b, where we shall meet your father is in the big hall. Focus in the big hall, prepositional phrase. 2e, what Ramesh is taller than the other boys. Taller than the other boys, adjective phrase. 2d, what Sally always does is spoil the fun. For spoil the fun, VP. What I do expect is to continue to work here. To continue to work here, S. A pseudo-cleft focus can belong to any major category, any of the big phrases. NP, PP, AP, VP, S. It doesn't care. Now let us go to the examples that show you what is possible in a cleft construction. Remember that NP is possible. It is the problem of diagnosis that you must consider. A 1b shows you can also get a PP. It is in the big hall that we shall meet your father. Focus in the big hall, prepositional phrase. However, VP, AP, S are impossible. 1c, it is to continue to work here that I do expect. Bad sentence. S is not possible. It is spoil the fun that Sally always does. Bad sentence. VP is not possible. It is taller than the other boys that Ramesh is. Bad sentence. AP is not possible. If you look hard enough, you find similar effects in Indian languages, though you have to tweak the examples considerably to detect the contrast. And you don't find it across the board. You're not able to show such a neat set of data as English because some of the testing is not possible. You can only show AP, the adjective phrase, patterning differently from NP and PP, noun phrase and postpositional phrase. Consider the so-called verbless sentence or zero copular construction in Bangla, which you don't get in Hindi Urdu. Bangla has sentences like Rupen a parar club secretary. Rupen this area's club secretary, meaning Rupen is the secretary of the club of this area. Without a verb to be, there is no is in the sentence. There is no word in the sentence that means is. Now in this sentence, what is on the right of Rupen is a noun phrase. In 3b, Rupen Shobhapati Rupure, Rupen above the chairman, meaning Rupen is above the chairman. What is to the right of Rupen is a postpositional phrase, a PP. Our third example, 3c, has an adjective phrase. Rupen Diti takar upor nirbhorshil. Rupen is dependent on Diti's money. Now you consider another construction based on this, in which you see the contrast. If you take the predicate, the material to the right of Rupen in examples 3 ABC, move that predicate to the left and make it a focus by attaching a focus particle, the dissociative focus particle E. Then you get good results for the NP and the PP. Recall that those are what are acceptable as the focus in the English Clefting construction. And you get bad results for the AP. Recall that the English Cleft construction doesn't allow an AP focus. Thus in 4A and B in Bangla, a parar club secretary Rupen, Shobhapati Rupuri Rupen, which is a reversal of Rupen is the secretary of the club of this area and Rupen is above the chairman. It would come out in English as the secretary of the club of this area is who Rupen is, or above the chairman is where Rupen is. These are okay with an NP and a PP brought forward and with a focus particle attached. But when you try it with an adjective phrase, 4C, when you try to say Diti takar upor nirbhorshili Rupen, which would have to mean dependent on Diti's money is what Rupen is, that is a crashingly bad sentence in Bangla. In fact, the English sentence doesn't sound so great. It isn't very easy to say dependent on Diti's money is what Rupen is. But the Bangla sentence is so bad it's even hard to understand. That is not the case with dependent on Diti's money is what Rupen is. It's understandable in English. What about the pseudo-cleft? We had shown that in English the pseudo-cleft permits the focus to be of any category. In particular, that it doesn't make a distinction between AP on the one hand and NP and PP on the other. Can we replicate that in Bangla? It turns out you can. If you start with 5ABC, you thought Rupen was the secretary of the club of this area, you thought Rupen was above the chairman, you thought Rupen was dependent on Diti's money. If you choose a format where Rupen is raised to the object of the matrix clause and you retain the structure where there is no overt copula in the embedded clause, you get structures like Tomi Rupenke, you Rupen accusative, a parar club secretary bhebechile, this area's club's secretary thought, meaning you thought Rupen the secretary of the club of this area. This is fine in the sequence that you have given, and in the examples given in the stretch 6A to 6C, you will find that when the predicate is taken out of this construction and placed at the right edge along the lines of the English pseudo-cleft construction, so that your first example comes out as 6A, you thought Rupen was the secretary of the club of this area. That comes out as Tomi Rupen ke bhebechile, you Rupen accusative thought, a parar club secretary, this area's club's secretary, with focal stress on the final word secretary or the final word upore for above or the final word nirbhorshil for dependent. All the examples come through intact. It becomes possible, even in the case of the adjective phrase dependent on Diti's money, to place it to the right without any mishap. So the effect that a focal element to the left must be an NP or a PP, but a focal element to the right can be an NP or a PP or an AP, is not a special fact about English. It can be reproduced in Bangla as well. This exercise leads us to conclude that the leftmost part of a sentence is somehow reserved for the topic, and that since NPs and PPs are potential topics, human language allows them to appear in this area which we shall call the topical zone. Languages strongly reject candidates from other categories like AP, PP and S. I'm sorry, AP, VP and S. If the topic wants to be a focus, so much the merrier. That, as we have seen, is allowed. The English cleft construction and the Bangla reversed zero copular construction illustrate this merger of the topic function and the focus function. But in the English pseudo-cleft and in the Bangla example 6A to C, where the stuff is pushed out to the right edge, you find that there's an unmerged, non-topicalized focus in the middle of the clause, the focal zone. You will ask us why we are calling it the middle of the clause, not the end of the clause. What we have shown you is appearing on what appears to be the right edge. We will explain a few minutes later why we are calling it the middle of the clause and not the end. There is in fact a true right-hand zone of the clause, not exemplified in the cases we have considered so far. That's why we're calling this the middle. In this focal zone, a focus can easily belong to the kind of category like adjective phrase that is unavailable for topics. Why should this be the case? Why should there be a discrimination between NPs and PPs on the one hand, potential topics, and EPs, VPs and S's, which are not potential topics, in the syntactic system? One hunch we have, and we invite you to see if it works for you when you continue to study linguistics, both in advanced syntax and in your semantic study. Our hunch is that a topic must be able to refer. Referential expressions in human language are NPs or PPs. Adjective phrases, verb phrases and sentences don't refer. Therefore, they are not acceptable topics. That is the hunch. We give you an exercise that brings back the flavor of syntactic research from the 1960s. Back then, people were so engrossed with the similarities between clefts and pseudo-clefts in English that they thought about deriving one from the other. We will not tell you what people actually said in their publications back then. That doesn't matter. In this course, we're not talking directly about the publications. We encourage you to do an exercise. Imagine that you're being asked to choose between deriving clefts from pseudo-clefts and deriving pseudo-clefts from clefts. Which of these methods would you find better, and why? Obviously, we're not asking you a historical question. You don't know the history of the 60s. We're asking you to step back into the material of that period and do it yourself. See what turns out to be efficient. Now let us put you out of your misery about the middle zone and the end zone. Why did we call the apparent end zone the middle? Why did we say the focal zone is in the middle of the sentence? Even though, as far as you could see, we were talking about the right-hand side. You see, the division of the sentence into zones was pioneered by the scholars who studied German syntax. In German, the basic fact to understand as you learn German syntax is the root sentence in German contrasts with embedded sentences particularly sharply, much more than in other languages. Consider sentence 7, which is an example of an embedded sentence. It means that John can soon go home. 7 takes the form that John soon home go kann. In German, das Johann bald nach Haus gehen kann. That is what an embedded sentence is like. It puts the auxiliary at the extreme right. Before the auxiliary, you get the verb. Before the verb, you get objects, complements, adjuncts, what have you. At the very start of the sentence, you get the complementizer. Between the complementizer on the left of the sentence and the finite auxiliary at the extreme right of the sentence, which is immediately preceded by the verb and any other auxiliaries in the verbal complex. Between that verbal complex and the complementizer on the left, you can put things in any order. Let us look at this to understand what we mean by any order. 8a. We won't give you the German words every time because it will distract you. Let us pretend English is German. You can say, soon can John to home go. To home can John soon go. John can soon to home go. These are what it looks like in a root sentence. In a root sentence, the topical zone extends from the beginning of the clause up to either the complementizer, which in an embedded sentence is that, or up to the finite auxiliary that comes to the front of a root sentence. In the examples 8a, 8b, 8c, that finite auxiliary is the word can. In example 7, which is an embedded clause, the topical zone is empty because there is nothing to the left of the complementizer. Embedded clauses work like this. In the examples 8a, b, c, which are root sentences, what occupies the topical zone is either the word for soon, or the expression for to home, or the word John. The middle zone of the German sentence, the focal zone, extends from the first goalpost to the second goalpost. The first goalpost is the complementizer, or the fronted finite auxiliary in the root sentence. The first goalpost in an embedded sentence is the complementizer. The first goalpost in a root sentence is the fronted finite auxiliary that takes the place of the complementizer. The second goalpost is the infinitival verb that is at the start of the verbal complex. So, the middle zone in which the focus can appear extends between the two goalposts. Now you begin to understand why there is yet another zone to the right of the focal zone. To the right of the focal zone, you can get additional material. Now let us add some precision to this description of the middle zone. The first goalpost is not always an auxiliary. It can be a finite verb. The second goalpost is not always an infinitival. If you have a very rudimentary sentence, you get a finite inflected simple verb with no auxiliary companion. There is no verbal complex in such a sentence of the John loves Mary type. The finite verb itself preposes from the second goalpost to the first goalpost. The result is corresponding to the embedded sentence that John soon to home goes. You get the root sentence 10a, soon goes John to home, or in the format 10b, John goes soon to home, or in the format 10c, to home goes John soon. These are frequent sentences. Because of these, and because in such examples the first goalpost is the verb in the second position, it has become a habit for people to call German a verb second language or a V2 language. Why? Because the root sentence has the verb in the second position. Sentences like 8 that we started with, where what is in second position is an auxiliary, were seen as examples of the same thing because people are used to seeing auxiliaries as one kind of verb in the very broad sense of the term. Now you need to understand that in pattern 10, the pattern that you see in soon goes John to home, for John is going home soon, the second goalpost is invisible because there is a finite verb, goes, and there is no infinitival in the sentence. That is why the middle zone in such a sentence, the focal zone, looks like it is at the end of the sentence. The second goalpost has disappeared, leaving the middle looking like the end. Now we are ready to show you what the third zone is like. When the second goalpost is visible, the third zone opens up. We shall call it the back zone. In 11a, you see material actually occupying the back zone. 11a is, John has already told me that he wants to go home soon with the German word order. John has me already told that he soon to go home, that he soon to home go wants. Here you can see that the back zone is occupied by the subordinate clause that he soon to home go wants, which means that he wants to go home soon. It appears after the second goalpost, which is the non-finite verb gesagt, told. Notice that if you try to take the third zone material and put it in the second zone, you get string number 11b, which is ungrammatical in German. What you've done in 11b is you've left the second goalpost at the very end of the sentence, gesagt, told, and you have tried to move the entire subordinate clause into the middle zone, the focal zone. The result is horrible. Nobody would dream of saying that in German. You can get a back zone not only in root sentences like 11, you can also get it in 12, where 12 shows the back zone occupied in a subordinate clause. Sentence 12 in English comes out as, Inge doesn't know that John has already told me that he wants to go home soon. To make the point, you don't really need the distinctive German word order. All you need to know is that in sentence 12, that he wants to go home soon is a subordinate clause that occupies the back zone of the other subordinate clause that John has already told me, ... There is an operation in German that can only be explained after we have introduced the boundaries between zones. So we are now ready to talk about that operation. It is called scrambling. It is the translation of the notion of free word order into the transformational machinery. Scrambling is a transformation that makes free word order happen. This operation takes place sometimes in the focal zone of a German sentence, turning 8c into 12. 12 is, John can to home soon go. Here what scrambling has done is interchange the position of the constituents to home and soon. You see, in German they say to home instead of home. Sometimes scrambling takes place not entirely within the focal zone, but across the focal zone, topical zone boundary. That derives 10A to C from a deep structure of the 9 type. 9 was that John soon to home goes, and 10A was soon goes John to home. Here what is happening is the element soon is being moved from the focal zone to the topical zone. That movement is the second kind of scrambling. The first kind of scrambling is interchanging two positions within the focal zone. The second kind of scrambling is moving something out of the focal zone into the topical zone. What about English topicalization? Does English topicalization qualify as a type of scrambling? When you say John I like but Mary I hate, is that scrambling? Have you moved material out of the focal zone into the topical zone? There are some similarities between topicalization and scrambling, but one very important difference is that quantified noun phrases such as every problem or everything can be scrambled, but they cannot be topicalized. English does not allow you to say everything John tends to dismiss in order to express the meaning John tends to dismiss everything. In German, however, you can perfectly easily say, mit jedem Student hat sie gesprochen, which means with every student has she talked, to express the meaning she has talked to every student. That's fine in German, but English doesn't let you say everything John tends to dismiss. This is an important difference, typological difference, between scrambling, which occurs in free constituent order languages, and topicalization of the English type that occurs in rigid constituent order languages such as English. We then give you an exercise to make sure that you grasp these ideas and can apply them to Indian language material. One reason for our introducing the notion of zones, the topic zone, the focal zone, and the back zone, is to help you to think about an issue considered in the previous module with additional equipment available. We are referring to the issue of the relation between lexical triggers and root transformations. Recall that we proposed a hypothesis that lexical triggers are only available in cyclic transformations, never in root transformations, and that we are trying to understand how and why this might be the case and whether the hypothesis actually holds. Now that you know about zones, there is more to say about that issue. It might have occurred to you that when we said there is an overall difference of style between the kind of stuff that root transformations do and the kind of phenomena that cyclic transformations deal with. Remember that we were very clear and positive in our characterization of the two types. We said root transformations tend to expand. They tend to stretch the sentence out, highlight some parts of it, dramatize some aspects of the situation, make you say hey and wow. In contrast, when transformations deal with embedded sentences, they tend to shorten them, they tend to delete stuff to make them shorter and to move things around, to integrate various pieces of the sentence. And the result is a lot of deletion and movement happens downstairs, and you need to keep tabs on those things happening, and that's why you need lexical triggers most of the time. Why should you need that in the root transformation? That's how we talked. When we were talking that way in the preceding module, you might have thought, what rubbish this man is saying. Consider root sentences like, see you, talk to you tomorrow. In these sentences, quite unlike the imperative sentences in which you and a volatile counterpart of will are deleted, In these sentences, as far as you can tell, what is deleted is a volatile counterpart of I and a volatile counterpart of will. So see you means I will see you, talk to you tomorrow means I will talk to you tomorrow. You may have noticed that examples of that kind, the see you or talk to you tomorrow kind, are lexically specified. We are quite likely to say see you tomorrow, talk to you tomorrow. We are very unlikely to say listen to you tomorrow. If you had this kind of data in view, you may have been laughing at me when you were listening to my presentation in the earlier module. You might have been saying this person is completely ridiculous. He doesn't see data that is right in front of his nose. He doesn't see that certain root transformations are lexically triggered, such as the transformation that deletes I and will, as distinct from imperative deletion. Imperative deletion is not lexically triggered. It applies with all verbs. But you might have thought, surely the special transformation that deletes I will in see you or talk to you tomorrow is lexically triggered by a certain class of verbs and that class alone. Now that you know about zones, you will notice something interesting. The see you type, the talk to you tomorrow type of expression doesn't make any use of the machinery of topical zone, focal zone, and back zone. By this we mean, if you consider an imperative sentence, imperative sentences can have a complete structure involving the focal zone and the back zone. They can't use the topical zone for obvious reasons, but they can use the focal zone and the back zone. So you get an imperative sentence that works as follows. Consider the possibility that you might have to keep this apparatus going for another 5 chapters. That's an imperative sentence. In that imperative sentence, you have this embedded clause that you might have to keep this apparatus going, blah, blah, blah. You can tweak this in various ways and make sure that the embedded clause comes after a finite verb. It is going to look like this. Try to understand. Try is the imperative part, but to understand is a verb. Try to understand that, and then you get a clause after it. The clause is a complement of the verb understand. Recall that when there's one of these non-finite verbs in German, it's the second goalpost, and stuff to the right of the second goalpost is in the back zone. So I've shown you that an imperative sentence can have a back zone. Now if you look at the sentences you were thinking of, that I'm imagining that you were thinking of, see you tomorrow, talk to you tomorrow, or see you, those sentences in which there is deletion of I will, if you want to think of it in those terms, never allow a back zone to play any role. Instead of talk to you tomorrow, one cannot imagine someone saying, tell you tomorrow that what you've been saying today doesn't make any sense. Or explain to you tomorrow that transformational grammar is one of the more important parts of linguistics. These are outrageously bad sentences. If you have a sentence in which I and will are missing, that sentence is obligatorily short. It stops very quickly, it's just a few words. Why? Because it isn't using the full machinery of syntax. It is only pretending to. Yes, there are special verbs that make this possible. Only a restricted set of verbs like see you, talk to you, and so on are acceptable in these settings. Because we are not dealing with proper, freely formed syntactic structures, we are dealing with phraseology. Phraseology is the study of fixed expressions, fixed collocations in language where certain words are strung together into formulas, and those formulas are used in a limited context. Only certain kinds of formulas are acceptable in the phraseological system of a language, which is halfway between the dictionary that deals with one word at a time and the syntax, which freely produces enormous structures. Phraseology is about structures bigger than the dictionary single words, but much smaller than what the syntax enables you to construct, which is huge constructions. Right beyond phraseology is another compartment of the structure of language known as proverbs. Proverbs have interesting shapes. You can say easy come, easy go. You can say monkey see, monkey do. There are these odd patterns of syntactic structure instantiated in proverbs. They often depart from contemporary grammatical practices. Sometimes you have something in between proverbs and formulaic expressions. You get fortune smiled on John, fortune smiled on Mary. This is a formulaic sentence template. This is where phraseology comes into play. The NP blank has to be filled to derive the sentence, fortune smiled on John. It's like filling out a form. Now, phraseology is on the margins of the linguistic system. The point we are making is that phraseological expressions are not the result of syntactic transformations applying to bigger deep structures, deleting some of the items and leaving only the formulaic content. If somebody says no problem, that's a piece of phraseology. It's not a surface structure derived from the deep structure, I have no problem, where I and have are deleted. No issues is not the result of taking the deep structure, I will raise no issues, and then deleting I will raise. Now that you understand the theory of zones, it becomes possible to make the right distinction between imperative structures which belong to the syntax and for which therefore it is appropriate to postulate an imperative deletion transformation, and these other examples that you may have been thinking of as counterexamples to our claim that root transformations never use lexical triggers, such as see you or talk to you tomorrow. You're now in a position to appreciate that phraseological expressions or formulaic expressions are halfway between the lexicon and the grammar. The grammar doesn't take full responsibility for them. Syntactic transformations do not derive them. In other words, talk to you tomorrow is not derived from I will talk to you tomorrow with deletion of I and will. It is what it is. It is a phraseological expression. It is understood in that form. Semantic interpretation takes that as an input and fleshes it out. There is no hidden deep structure material that gets deleted transformationally. Therefore, the fact that there are lexical patterns, that there are particular verbs which alone make it possible to use this format, does not mean that there are lexical triggers for a root transformation deleting I and will, because there is no root transformation deleting I and will. We are now in a position to conclude this discussion by summarizing what we have done. We first took you through English cleft and pseudo-cleft constructions to show how the geometry of focus is organized in English, and we then showed you that there is an interaction between that of topics and that of foci when you contrast the behavior of clefts in English with that of pseudo-clefts in English. We then showed you that these effects can be replicated in the Indian language Bangla, that therefore they are not confined to English alone, and that we can conclude that roughly the left-hand side of a sentence is a topical zone. The middle of the sentence is a focal zone. And that we don't yet have enough justification to postulate a third zone, but at that stage we left open the possibility of a third zone. We then took you into German data, giving you justification for postulating a third zone after the focal zone. And we showed that German has very clear goalposts, enabling us to delimit the boundary between the topical and the focal zone, and between the focal zone and the back zone. Having set up this elaborate apparatus, we then showed you that we can get back to a topic raised in the previous module about root transformations not using lexical triggers. And that one potentially lethal objection to that hypothesis can be diffused by using the theory of zones to draw the right distinction between imperatives, where there is indeed a transformation deleting the subject and the auxiliary, and apparent examples of I will deletion, like the formula see you tomorrow or talk to you tomorrow. We argued that these are formulas, they are phraseological expressions, and that their formulaic character makes it inappropriate to apply transformations to derive them from plausible deep structures. We showed this by demonstrating the structural difference between imperative sentences, which have back zone material and therefore bring the apparatus of zones into play, and these formulaic expressions which never allow you to open up the back zone, thus demonstrating that they're formulaic expressions. That was the business of this module. We encourage you to keep reading the e-texts and to keep following up on the reading suggestions that the e-texts provide for supplementary reading. We invite you to provide any feedback you might have. And we thank you for your attention.